The outpost's dim lights flickered like dying stars against the endless gray of the dome. Ilara adjusted the seal on her envirosuit, her gloved fingers tracing the familiar ridges of the airlock panel. At 32 cycles old, she was the longest-serving technician on Kale 7, a speck of human ingenuity clinging to the galaxy's edge. Her hair, cropped short under the helmet, itched faintly, but she ignored it, priorities first. The colony's hydroponics bay had been leaking for days, and with the last supply shuttle overdue by a week, they couldn't afford another failure. "Status check," she murmured into the comm, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The habitat module hummed around her, a patchwork of salvaged parts from the original landing 50 years ago. Outside, the planet's atmosphere churned in perpetual dust storms, a rusty haze that had swallowed Earth's blue skies in humanity's rearview. From the control room, Jax's reply crackled through. "All green here, L vitals stable, power at 70%. You sure you don't want backup?" His tone carried that easy confidence, the kind that came from being the pilot who'd flown them all through the wormhole exodus. Tall and wiry, with a scar across his jaw from a botched repair years back, Jax was the optimist, always cracking wise to cut the tension. Ilara punched in the override code, the airlock hissing open to reveal the tunnel's reinforced corridor. "I'm sure. It's just a patch job. Stay put and monitor the feeds." She stepped through, boots magnetizing to the grated floor with a soft thud. The colony had only 4 of them left now, her, Jax, Mira the medic, and old Tomas the engineer. The rest had shipped out on the final evacuation run, chasing rumors of habitable worlds beyond the fringe. Humanity's great departure, they called it, silent, orderly, leaving behind outposts like this one to monitor the automated relays. The hydroponics bay was a greenhouse turned crypt, rows of wilted vines sagging under LED strips that buzzed faintly. Ilara knelt by the main tank, her suit's HUD overlaying schematics in glowing blue. A hairline fracture in the outer hull, probably from the last quake, had let in corrosive particles. She pulled the sealant gun from her belt, the tool's whine filling the space as she began the weld. Halfway through, the ground trembled. Not the usual microshake, but a deep rumble that vibrated up her spine. Alarms blared in her helmet, red warnings flashing. Seismic activity elevated. Structural integrity compromised. "Jax, we've got a big one incoming." She sealed the last inch and scrambled back, but the floor buckled beneath her, panels groaning as a crack spiderwebbed across the deck. "Evac protocol. Get to the core module, now." Jax's voice sharpened, all levity gone. Through the comm, she heard Myra's calm instructions barking orders, Tomas's gruff acknowledgments. Ilara ran, the tunnel lights strobing with the quake's fury. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and for a heartbeat she glimpsed the outer dome through a viewport, the sky beyond, that eternal ochre storm, unbroken and indifferent. She slammed the inner airlock shut just as the outer one buckled, a rush of tainted air hissing briefly before the seals held. Panting, she stripped off the helmet in the core module, the recycled air cool against her flushed skin. Jax was there, helping Mira secure the med bay straps, while Tomas hunched over the console, his weathered hands flying across keys. "Damage report," Ilara said, wiping sweat from her brow. The quake had passed, but the aftershocks lingered in the wall's faint creaks. Tomas glanced up, his eyes sharp behind grease-smeared glasses. Cautious by nature, he'd been the one to argue against the evacuation, insisting they could hold the line. "Hydroponics is toast, 50% loss. But worse, the relay antenna sheared off. No contact with Central Command until we fix it." Jax clapped Ilara on the shoulder, his grin forced. "Good thing you're our fix-it wizard. What's the play?" She met his gaze, the weight settling in. Without the relay they were ghosts in the system, no resupply, no evac. The departure had been humanity's bid for survival, scattering seeds across the void. But here, on this forsaken rock, silence meant isolation. And the storms were only getting worse. Ilara's claws scraped against the rusted hull as she hauled herself up the final ladder to the observation deck. The air recyclers hummed faintly below, a reminder that their makeshift habitat still breathed, for now. She glanced back at Core, who lagged behind, his broad shoulders hunched against the weight of the toolkit slung over his back. "Keep up, you lumbering rock-eater," she called, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The filters won't fix themselves." Kor grunted, wiping sweat from his scaled brow. "If you'd stop rushing like a sandstorm, maybe I could think straight. That human relic down there, it's not going to explode just because we poke it." Below them stretched the vast chamber of the old orbital station, a ghost from the era when the humans had ruled the skies. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the cracked viewports, and the floor was littered with forgotten consoles, their screens long shattered into fractal patterns of glass. Elara had always marveled at the humans' engineering, sleek, efficient, built to last eternities. But now, with their species vanished without a trace, it all felt like a cruel joke. The sky outside, once a vibrant blue through the filters, had faded to a sickly gray, as if the stars themselves mourned the silence. They reached the control node, a bulbous room ringed with flickering holograms. Mira was already there, her lithe form perched on a stool scavenged from the debris, fiddling with a jury-rigged probe. The young technician's eyes lit up as they entered. "Finally, I've got the schematics pulled from the archive core. The atmospheric processors are tied into this mainframe. If we can reroute the power grid, we might stabilize the outer hull integrity." Elara nodded, her cautious nature warring with the urgency gnawing at her gut. The station's slow decay had accelerated in the last cycle. Micrometeorites were punching through the shielding, and their oxygen reserves were dipping dangerously low. No more delays. "Show me the plan. Kor, get the welder ready in case we need to seal breaches." Mira projected the diagram, a web of glowing lines snaking through the station's innards. "We isolate the secondary relays here," she said, tracing a path with her claw, "bypass the corrupted nodes, and feed auxiliary power from the solar arrays. It should buy us a month, maybe two." Kor leaned in, his witty skepticism surfacing. "A month? That's optimistic for human tech. Remember the last time we trusted one of their simple fixes? I spent 3 days unclogging vents full of that fibrous gunk they called insulation." Elara shot him a look. "We don't have the luxury of doubt. The rival clans from the lower rings are already sniffing around. If they claim this station, we're back to scraping lichen on the surface." She activated the interface, her fingers dancing over the alien controls adapted for their physiology. The holograms pulsed in response, and for a moment, hope flickered like the dying lights. But as the reroute initiated, alarms blared, a sharp, wailing cacophony that made Elara's spines bristle. The diagram fractured, lines twisting into error codes. "What?" Mira lunged for the console, but it was too late. A surge rippled through the grid, and the lights dimmed to emergency red. From the viewport, they watched in horror as a section of the hull buckled outward, venting precious air into the void. Debris spiraled away, catching the gray light like forgotten confetti. Kor cursed, grabbing his toolkit. "Told you. Human ingenuity, more like human insanity. That backfire just widened the breach." Elara's mind raced, the weight of command pressing down. They had to seal it manually now before the whole deck depressurized. Mira suit up and grabbed the patch kit. "Kor with me, we're going EVA." As they moved, the station groaned, a deep vibration underscoring the peril. The sky beyond remained indifferent, its forgotten colors a silent testament to what they'd lost. The dim hum of the habitat module's recyclers filled the air like a distant heartbeat, pulling Elena from a fitful sleep. She sat up on her bunk, rubbing the grit from her eyes, the metallic tang of recycled air sharp on her tongue. Outside the porthole, the sky stretched in bruised purples, devoid of the blue she'd known from holovids of old Earth. Humanity's silent exodus had left this world stripped of its vibrancy, the atmosphere thinning under relentless solar winds. Marcus was already at the console, his fingers dancing over the flickering display, while Lila paced the narrow corridor, her tablet clutched like a shield. "We've got maybe 48 hours before the filters give out completely," Marcus said, his voice laced with that wry edge that kept them sane. He leaned back, cracking his knuckles, the sound echoing too loudly in the confined space. "The backup units fused, looks like a micrometeorite kiss from the outer rings. Clever little bastard." Elena swung her legs over the bunk's edge, boots hitting the grated floor with a thud. She was the steady one, the captain who turned grit into glue, but even she felt the weight of their isolation pressing in. The colony ship, Odyssey's remnant, had been their ark after Earth's quiet departure, ferrying the last wave of humans to this forsaken rock on the galaxy's fringe. Now, with comms dead and supplies dwindling, the external challenge loomed. The planet's volatile ion storms, whipping up dust that clogged every intake. One wrong move, and the air would turn toxic, suffocating them in their own refuge. Lila stopped pacing, her cautious eyes narrowing behind smudged lenses. We can't just patch it again. The last repair held for 12 hours before it backfired, remember? The surge fried half our power grid. She glanced at Elena, seeking alliance in the uncertainty. Pushing forward with the EVA plan is suicide. The storm's peaking, visibility zero. Marcus snorted, swiveling in his chair to face them. And sitting here is what, a vacation? Look, I've rigged a bypass using the auxiliary thruster's coolant lines. It'll reroute the filtration through the outer hull vents, bypasses the damaged core entirely. His grin was lopsided, the wit masking the fear they all carried. Human ingenuity, right? We didn't bail on Earth for nothing. Elena stood, crossing to the console, her hand resting on Marcus's shoulder, a brief camaraderie that spoke volumes. She studied the schematics, lines of code pulsing like veins. The plan sounded solid, born of late-night brainstorming under the colony's harsh lights, but doubt gnawed at her. They tried something similar days ago, and the storm had twisted it into chaos, nearly costing Lila her suit's seal. Still, inaction meant death by inches. Suit up, she decided, voice firm. We adapt or we fade. Lila, monitor from here. Marcus, you're with me on the hull. The airlock cycled with a hiss, expelling them into the void. Elena's suit lights cut through the swirling dust, illuminating jagged outcrops of the planet's crust like forgotten teeth. The ion storm raged, electrostatic crackles dancing along the ship's scarred fuselage, pulling at their tethers with invisible fury. Marcus moved ahead, his toolkit clipped to his belt, clipping the bypass line into place with practiced ease. See? Smooth as a sudden gust slammed into them, the storm's fury manifesting as a whip of charged particles. Elena braced against the hull, her boots magnetized, but Marcus's tethers snapped taut, yanking him sideways. Hold, she shouted over the comms, lunging to secure him. The line he'd just connected sparked, arcs of blue energy leaping across the metal, feeding back into the system. Inside, Lila's voice crackled through. Elena, readings are spiking. The bypass is overloading, shut it down. Too late. The surge rippled through the ship, lights flickering in Elena's helmet display as auxiliary systems whined in protest. Marcus cursed, wrestling the connection free, but the damage was done. A secondary filter burst, venting precious oxygen into the storm. Elena hauled him back toward the airlock, the sky's forgotten colors blurring in her vision, purples deepening to black, a reminder of what they'd lost. They tumbled inside, seals hissing shut behind them, but the habitat's alarms blared now, red lights painting their faces in warning. Lila met them at the inner door, face pale. We've lost 20% capacity. The storm's pushing contaminants in, air quality's dropping fast. She helped Marcus out of his suit, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. Elena peeled off her helmet, sweat stinging her eyes, the earnest pull of survival tightening her chest. Their early plan had backfired spectacularly, raising the stakes. Not just shortage now, but active poisoning. Yet in Marcus's wry glance and Lila's determined nod, she saw the spark of adaptation. They weren't done, not by a long shot. The sky outside might have forgotten its color, but they remembered how to fight for breath. Ilera gripped the edge of the control panel, her knuckles whitening against the cold metal. The hum of the auxiliary generators filled the dim cabin, a relentless drone that matched the pounding in her temples. Outside the viewport, the sky stretched in bruised purples, the once vibrant hues of Zoratha's atmosphere now leached to a sickly pallor. She glanced at Jax, who was hunched over the diagnostic screen, his brow furrowed in that familiar mix of determination and quiet fury. We've got maybe 12 hours before the filters give out completely, Jax said, his voice steady but edged with gravel. He tapped the display, pulling up schematics of the life support array. The corrosion's worse than we thought. Whatever that anomaly did, it ate through the seals like acid. Mira, ever the cautious one, paced behind them, her tail flicking nervously, a Zarathian tick that betrayed her unease. We should signal the outpost again. If the comms are down because of interference, not failure, they might still hear us. She stopped, crossing her arms, her scales shimmering faintly under the emergency lights. Staying here fiddling with repairs is just delaying the inevitable. Jax straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. And say what? Hey, the sky's poisoned and our ship's dying? Last burst we sent got nothing but static. No, we fixed this ourselves. He shot Alara a look, seeking backup. Human stubbornness, she thought, but it was the kind that had kept them alive this long. Alara nodded, pushing off the panel to grab a toolkit from the overhead bin. Myra's right about one thing, we can't wait. But Jax too. The outpost is 3 days out, and without Atmo integrity, we'll be breathing dust by dawn. She pried open an access hatch, the hiss of escaping pressure making her wince. Inside, conduits snaked like veins, some already frayed and leaking a faint, acrid mist. The air recyclers were the heart of it all, and if they failed, the silence of departure would claim them just like it had the others. They worked in tandem, the cabin a blur of motion. Jax rerouted power from non-essentials. The galley lights flickered out, plunging half the space into shadow, while Mira monitored external sensors, her claws clicking against the console. Alara dove into the guts of the system, splicing wires with hands that trembled only slightly. She'd always been the brave one, the first to volunteer for surface runs, but today the stakes clawed at her resolve. The anomaly had come without warning 2 cycles ago, a ripple in the sky, silent as a held breath, turning the world gray. Ships vanished, comms went dark, and now their colony's edge outpost was a ghost. A spark jumped as Alara connected a bypass. She jerked back, cursing under her breath. Damn it. The corrosion spread to the secondary manifold. We're losing pressure in Sector 3. Jax was at her side in an instant, peering into the hatch. Can you seal it? Not without fresh sealant. We used the last on the hull breach yesterday. Alara's mind raced, piecing together scraps of memory from training sims back on Earth. Humans had built these ships to endure, but Zoratha's storms were rewriting the rules. She grabbed a length of flexible tubing from the kit, an idea forming. Hand me the thermal cutter. We improvise. Myra's voice cut through the tension from across the room. Sensors picking up movement, ground side. Something big heading this way. Not a storm, but patterns matched the scavenger packs from the rift valleys. Jax froze, his cutter hovering. How far? 2 clicks and closing. Fast. Myra's eyes widened, her tail coiling tight. If they reach us before we stabilize. Alara sliced through the tubing with precise strokes, her breaths coming short. The scavengers, hulking, silicon-based horrors that thrived on the anomaly's fallout, had been a nuisance before, picking at debris. Now, with the sky's poison thickening, they hunted anything that hummed with life. We seal this, then we move. No choice. The improvised patch held as she welded it in place, the metal glowing briefly before cooling to a dull sheen. Alarms blared softly, warning of dropping oxygen levels, but the pressure gauge ticked upward, stabilizing if barely. Jax clapped her shoulder, a rare grin breaking through. That's my engineer. Knew you'd pull it off. But the triumph was short-lived. Myra's console lit up with proximity alerts, the scavenger's low-frequency roars vibrating through the hull. Alara sealed the hatch and rushed to the viewport, heart slamming. Shadows lumbered across the barren plain, their forms jagged against the faded sky. One reared up, silhouetted like a nightmare etched in stone. We lift now, Jax ordered, sliding into the pilot's seat. Engines at half, don't want to draw more. Mira strapped in, her caution yielding to action. Course for the outpost. If we push it, we might make it by nightfall. Alara took her station, fingers flying over the NAV controls. The ship groaned as thrusters fired, lifting them from the cracked earth. Below, the pack scattered, but not before one lunged, claws scraping the underbelly with a screech that echoed in their bones. They cleared the ridge, the sky swallowing them whole, but the lingering haze seeped into every breath, a reminder that silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Ilara gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles whitening against the faint glow of the readouts. The ship's hum had grown erratic, a stuttering pulse that mirrored the ache in her temples. Outside the viewport, the nebulous tendrils swirled in muted purples, indifferent to their plight. "We've got maybe an hour before the core overheats," she said, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. Kai, ever the optimist, leaned over the diagnostic panel, his fingers dancing across the flickering holograph. 1 hour to MacGyver a fusion stabilizer from scrap. Piece of cake. His grin didn't reach his eyes, but it pulled a reluctant huff from Lyra in the corner, where she sorted through the salvaged parts with mechanical precision. The initial plan, to reroute power from the auxiliary thrusters, had backfired spectacularly. A surge had fried half the conduits, leaving the engineering base smelling of ozone and regret. Now, with the rival scavenger drones closing in from the asteroid belt, time wasn't just ticking, it was clawing at them. Ilara wiped her brow and straightened, her cautious nature warring with the fire Kai always seemed to ignite. "We can't afford another mistake. Those drones aren't playing. One hit and we're debris." Lyra nodded, her witty retort silenced by the gravity of it all. She held up a warped alloy plate, its surface etched with faint human script, relics from the old colony ships that had ghosted this sector centuries ago. Kai snatched the plate, eyes lighting up. "This is it. Human ingenuity at its finest. See these microfissures? They're not flaws, they're channels." He jabbed at the console, pulling up schematics from the archive. The display bloomed with faded blueprints, lines of code written in a language that felt almost poetic in its efficiency. Ilara watched, skeptical but intrigued. The humans had departed in silence, leaving behind worlds stripped of color, skies that forgot their blues. But their machines? They whispered secrets still. "If we align this with the core's exhaust vents, it could dissipate the heat like a radiator fin. But it'll need calibration, precise, or it'll shatter under pressure." Tension coiled in the air as they worked. Lyra fed coordinates into the fabricator, her hands steady despite the ship's tremors. "You're betting our lives on ancient graffiti," she muttered, but there was no bite in it. Kai chuckled, soldering a connection with a makeshift torch. Sparks flew, illuminating the scars on his arms from past salvage runs. Ilara monitored the drone signatures, their blips inching closer on the tactical overlay. One veered off, probing a nearby wreck, but the lead drone hummed with aggressive intent, its sensors likely picking up their energy signature. The first test run sent a jolt through the deck plating. Alarms blared briefly before Kai slapped them silent. "Too much flow. Dial it back." Ilara adjusted the valves, her brave resolve hardening. She thought of the stories, how humans had tamed stars with nothing but grit and camaraderie. No empires, no heroes, just people adapting one fix at a time. Lyra handed over a coil of wiring, her expression softening. "If this works, we owe those ghosts a toast." The nebula outside pulsed as if listening. As the core's whine steadied, a shadow crossed the viewport. The lead drone, sleek and unforgiving, locked onto them. Kai's hands blurred, finalizing the seal. "Hold on. This is the earned part." Ilara braced, heart pounding, while Lyra whispered a quiet calculation. The drone fired, a warning shot that grazed the hull, shearing off a sensor array. Sparks erupted, but the ship held. The modified plate glowed faintly, channeling the excess heat into harmless vapor trails. They exhaled in unison as the core purred back to life. The drones hesitated, recalculating, then peeled away toward easier prey. But victory tasted bittersweet. The array's loss meant blind spots in navigation, a lingering consequence that would haunt their next jump. Ilara met Kai's gaze, a silent pact forming. They weren't done adapting yet. The sky beyond remained colorless, but in that moment, their corner of it burned with possibility. The ship's hum had turned erratic, a stuttering pulse that mirrored the storm raging outside. "This isn't holding," she muttered, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. Jax leaned over her shoulder, his wiry frame tense, eyes scanning the flickering screens. "We rerouted power twice already. If we push the engines now, we might fry the core. The alien vessel, a sleek probe from the Zorath Collective, shuddered as another gust slammed into its hull. They'd come to this forsaken rock. Earth, the humans called it, chasing echoes of a species that had vanished without a trace. But the planet fought back, its atmosphere thick with ionized particles that clawed at their shields like invisible talons. What was meant to be a routine survey had spiraled into survival, the sky above a bruised swirl of grays and indigos, stripped of the blues the ancient records promised. Kale, ever the cautious one, paced the cramped bridge, his elongated fingers tapping against his thigh. We should abort the descent. The archives said humans adapted to this chaos, but we're not them. His words carried the weight of their dwindling resources. Oxygen recyclers straining, fuel cells dipping below critical. Elara shot him a glance, her brave streak flaring. And leave the signal source? Down there in that canyon. If we turn back, the collective will brand us failures. The plan had been simple at launch. Skim the surface, map the ruins, retrieve any artifacts from the silent departure. But the storm had hit mid-descent, a freak atmospheric brew that humans must have tamed with their ingenuity. Their early probe had glitched, forcing a hard landing on a fractured plateau. Now, grounded and battered, they faced the real challenge. A resource shortage that turned every decision into a gamble. Jax wiped his brow, his wits surfacing in the tension. Humans built cities that withstood worse than this. Maybe they left us a gift. He jabbed at a schematic, highlighting a nearby structure half buried in the dust. Old human outpost. Could have salvageable tech. Batteries, maybe even atmospheric filters. Elara nodded, calculating risks in her head. The storm's howl rattled the ports, wind whipping sand against the reinforced glass. One vivid streak of lightning forked across the void, illuminating jagged peaks that clawed at the clouds. She stood, sealing her suit with a hiss. I'm going out. Jax, monitor from here. Kale, you're with me. Kale hesitated, his cautious nature pulling him back. The radiation spikes will kill us slower than suffocation, she cut in, her tone earnest, no room for debate. The airlock cycled open, blasting them with the planet's raw breath, acrid, electric, alive in a way their sterile worlds never were. They trudged into the gale, boots sinking into reddish soil that crumbled like forgotten bone. The outpost loomed ahead, a skeletal frame of rusted metal and shattered concrete, vines of Sami-resilient weed snaking through its ribs. Halfway there, the wind shifted, howling fiercer, and Elara's visor cracked under a hurled shard of rock. Alarms blared in her helmet, oxygen hissing out. She stumbled, Kale catching her arm. Back, now, he yelled over the comms, but she pressed on, grit overriding caution. Inside the outpost, shadows danced from their helmet lights, revealing consoles long dead, wires spilling like entrails. Jax's voice crackled through. Scans show a power cell intact. Buried under debris, hurry. They dug, hands scraping earth that tasted of iron and loss. The cell emerged, humming faintly, a relic of human endurance. But as Elara hefted it, the ground trembled, a aftershock from the storm's fury or something deeper. Kale's eyes widened behind his visor. The canyon's unstable. If we trigger a slide. He trailed off, the weight of their choice settling. They bolted back, the cell clutched like a fragile hope, the sky above churning without mercy. By the time they sealed the airlock, the ship's lights dimmed further, the storm's toll etched in every groan of the hull. Elara plugged in the cell, sparks flying as power surged. The engines whined back to life, but not fully. The integration was makeshift, leaving them limping. Jax grinned faintly. Human trick. It works, but we'll burn hot. One shot to lift off before the core overheats. Kale slumped into his seat, the cost lingering in his silence. The storm had claimed their secondary probe, data lost to the void. And as the ship clawed upward, the sky seemed to watch, its forgotten colors a silent accusation. They had a chance now, but the planet's grudge followed, a shadow in the rear sensors. Elara gripped the console edge as the shuttle shuddered, the hum of failing engines vibrating through her bones. Outside the viewport, the gas giant's swirling storms painted the void in bruised purples and golds, a beauty that mocked their plight. She'd always been the cautious one, double-checking seals and plotting redundancies, but caution hadn't stopped the micrometeorite from punching through the fuel lines. Now, with oxygen ticking down and the nearest relay station a ghost in their NAV charts, doubt clawed at her gut. "Talk to me, Jax," she said, voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead. Her brother hunched over the auxiliary panel, his wiry frame tense, fingers dancing across the flickering holograph. Jax was the brave sort, charging into unknowns with a grin, but even he couldn't hide the furrow in his brow. "Scans show a debris field ahead, old mining rigs from the first wave. If we can snag some volatiles, maybe jury-rig a patch." He glanced up, eyes sharp. "But it's tight. One wrong nudge and we're part of the scrap." Mira, their pilot and the group's unspoken anchor, leaned back from the yoke, wiping grease from her cheek. Witty under fire, she'd cracked jokes through the initial breach, but now her silence spoke volumes. "Your call, Ilara. We limp to the station or we dive into that graveyard." Ilara waited, the air recyclers wheezing like an old man's cough. The challenge wasn't just the storm's pull or the failing thrust. It was the isolation, the knowledge that back on the colony ship, hundreds waited for resupply. One mistake and those faces, families, dreamers, faded to statistics. "Graveyard it is." Mira, plot a skim trajectory. Jax, prep the grapples. The shuttle dipped, engines protesting with a guttural whine. Alarms blared as they entered the field, twisted hulks of forgotten machinery tumbling in lazy orbits. Myra's hands blurred on the controls, evading a jagged spar by inches. "Got a candidate, ice hauler looks intact." Her voice cut through the din, calm as a summer breeze. Jax fired the grapples, magnetic claws latching with a jolt that slung them sideways. Ilara braced, watching the derelict swing into view. A relic from humanity's early push outward, its hull scarred but holding atmosphere traces. They suited up in the airlock, the ritual grounding her racing thoughts. Jax clapped her shoulder. "We've danced with worse. Remember that sandstorm on Vega Prime?" She nodded, forcing a half-smile. "You mean when you nearly got us buried?" But the banter eased the knot in her chest. EVA was a blur of zero-G tumbles and tool clips. The hauler's lock cycled after Jax hot-wired it, revealing a cavernous hold dusted with frozen methane crystals, glinting like shattered stars. Ilara's scanner beeped, viable fuel precursors, enough to buy them time. But as they siphoned, a tremor rippled through the deck. "Structural fatigue," Jax muttered. "We overloaded and—" The hauler buckled. A support beam snapped, hurling debris. Ilara shoved Jax aside, her suit's thrusters firing wild as a chunk clipped her leg. Pain flared, hot and immediate, but she clamped it down, hauling the canister free. "Got it? Back to the shuttle." Myra's voice crackled over comms. "Storm's closing, currents pulling you off vector. Move." They jettisoned back, the canister clutched like a lifeline. Docking was chaos. The shuttle spun from the giant's gravity, Mira wrestling it steady. Ilara tumbled in last, leg throbbing, blood flecking her visor. Jax sealed the hatch, already splicing lines to the jury rig. Hours blurred in the engineering bay. Jax's clever adaptation shone. A makeshift exchanger using hauler parts to distill the volatiles into propellant. Ilara monitored from her crash couch, painkillers dulling the ache but not the worry. The cost was real. Her mobility shot, resupply delayed, and the storm's edge now nipping at their tail. As thrust stabilized, Mira punched in the course correction. "We're clear. Station in 12 hours. Jax slumped beside Ilara, exhaustion etching his face. "Told you we'd make it." She met his gaze, the viewport framing the fading storms. Silence had marked humanity's departure from countless worlds, leaving skies stripped of color. But here, in the grid of survival, they repainted it, one desperate fix at a time. The leg would heal, scarred but stronger. The mission pressed on. Elena gripped the railing of the observation deck, her knuckles whitening against the cold metal. The sky outside the habitat dome stretched in unnatural hues, once a brilliant blue, now a sickly smear of gray and violet, as if the atmosphere itself had surrendered to exhaustion. She turned to Marcus, who hunched over the console, his fingers dancing across the holographic display with the precision of a man defusing a bomb he knew might detonate anyway. "We've got maybe 12 hours before the chem siphons overload," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with that cautious edge she relied on. He didn't look up, eyes fixed on the fluctuating readouts. "The filters are clogging faster than projected. Whatever's in the upper atmosphere, it's not just particulates. It's reactive." Jax leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Reactive, huh? Like the universe decided to throw a tantrum after we pieced out. Bet it's pissed we left the lights on." He pushed off the wall, sauntering over to peer at the screen. His wit was a shield, Elena knew, but today it felt thinner, cracked by the weight of their isolation. The habitat hummed faintly, a relic of humanity's grand exit 3 decades prior. Most had boarded the Arcs, fleeing a dying Earth for distant stars, but Elena's team, caretakers they called themselves, had stayed to oversee the final shutdown. Secure the vaults, neutralize the waste, ensure the planet didn't choke on its own remnants. Simple enough, until the sky forgot its color and the air turned venomous. Their first plan had been elegant: deploy the orbital mirrors to burn off the atmospheric toxins, reflecting sunlight in targeted bursts. But the mirrors, ancient and finicky, had jammed mid-sequence. One had shattered under micrometeorite fire, sending debris spiraling into the mesosphere and worsening the chemical soup. Now, with the siphons failing, the dome's integrity was the only thing keeping them from the poison winds. Elena straightened, forcing resolve into her posture. "We adapt. Jax, can you rig a bypass on the secondary vents? Pull from the emergency reserves." Jax rubbed his chin, eyes narrowing. "Possible, but it'll drain the O2 recyclers. We breathe shallow for a day or two maybe? And if the storm hits early." He trailed off, glancing at the viewport where clouds boiled like ink in water. Marcus finally looked up, his face etched with lines deeper than yesterday. "The storm's our real problem. Models show it'll strip the dome's coating if we don't reinforce it. We need those siphons online, or we're ventilating straight into hell." She nodded, the decision settling like lead in her gut. No speeches, no rallying cries, just action. "Marcus, you and I suit up for the exterior repair. Jax, handle the bypass from inside. Sync on the comms." They moved with practiced efficiency, the camaraderie born of years sealing cracks in a world that no longer cared. Elena sealed her suit, the hiss of pressurization a familiar comfort. As the airlock cycled, she caught Jax's eye through the inner pane. He gave a thumbs up, his grin defiant. Outside, the wind howled, whipping gray dust across the dome's curve. Elena clipped her tether to the framework, the metallic tang of recycled air filling her helmet. Marcus followed, his movements deliberate, checking seals twice over. The sky loomed above, a bruised canopy that swallowed the sun, casting their world in perpetual twilight. They reached the siphon array midway up the dome, a cluster of exhaust ports crusted with iridescent residue. Elena activated her torch, the blue flame cutting through the buildup like a scalpel. Sparks flew, dancing in the gusts, and for a moment she glimpsed the old Earth in her mind's eye, vibrant, alive, worth the leaving. "Contact," Marcus reported, his voice crackling over the link. He wedged a probe into a clogged valve, twisting with cautious force. "It's binding. Chemical bonds are stronger than we thought." "Keep at it," she urged, slicing deeper. Below, the habitat's lights flickered, a warning from Jax's bypass straining the grid. The storm's edge brushed them then, a sudden pressure wave that yanked at their tethers. Elena braced, her boots magnetized to the dome, but the wind clawed insistent, promising more. Inside, Jax wiped sweat from his brow, rerouting power cables with hands that trembled just slightly. The console beeped erratically, reserves dipping into the red. "Boss, you've got incoming. Winds at 60 knots and climbing. Get those vents clear or we're all painting the walls with regret." Elena's torch faltered against a stubborn deposit, the metal groaning under the assault. She leaned in, ignoring the strain in her shoulders. One more cut, and the siphon might breathe again. But the sky darkened further, the violet deepening to near black, as if the world itself conspired to erase their fragile hold. Marcus's probe snapped, the tool shearing clean. He cursed softly, the sound human and raw amid the mechanical din. It's not enough. We need to flush the lines manually, risky, but it'll buy time. She hesitated, the cost clear. Exposure to the toxins even in suits could compromise their return. But the alternative was watching the dome crack under the storm's fury. Do it, she said. Together. As they initiated the flush, a low rumble built in the distance, the storm's heart approaching. The residue bubbled and hissed, venting in toxic plumes that swirled around them like ghosts of the departed. Elena felt the first real bite of uncertainty, not fear but the sharp awareness that their ingenuity might not outpace the dim glow of the habitat module's emergency lights flickered like dying stars against the reinforced bulkhead. Ilera wiped sweat from her brow, her fingers leaving streaks of grime on her skin. The air recyclers hummed unevenly, pulling in the faint metallic tang that had seeped through the seal since the breach. She glanced at Jax, who was hunched over the control panel, his wiry frame tense as he rerouted power from non-essentials. This patch job's holding but not for long, he muttered, his voice steady despite the strain. The outer hull's buckling under that wind shear. We need to seal it before the next gust hits. Mira, ever the cautious one, knelt nearby, methodically sealing microfractures in the inner lining with a sealant gun. Her hands moved with deliberate precision, but her eyes darted to the viewport, where the sky roiled in bruised purples and grays, a far cry from the blue humanity had once claimed. We should have listened to the scans, she said, not accusing, just stating the obvious under pressure. That storm front wasn't natural. Whatever's left in the atmosphere is amplifying it. The words hung between them, a reminder of the cost. Their shuttle crippled, supplies dwindling, and the faint signal from the orbital relay growing static-laced. Jack straightened, rubbing his neck where a fresh bruise bloomed from the earlier jolt. He was the brave one, the one who'd pushed for the descent despite the warnings, driven by that stubborn human grit to reclaim what was lost. Plans change. We adapt. He pulled up a holographic schematic, the projection jittering as power dipped. The habitat clung to the skeletal remains of an old launch tower on what used to be the plains of Kansas, now a fractured wasteland where silicate winds scoured the earth like invisible blades. Their initial landing had been textbook. Touch down, deploy sensors, sample the regrown soil for signs of recovery. But the sky had other ideas. The atmospheric anomaly, a remnant of the silent departure decades ago when humanity fled the dying world, had twisted into something fierce, trapping them. Ilera nodded, her witty edge dulled by fatigue but not gone. Adapt, sure. But if we don't get that auxiliary generator online, we're breathing our own exhaust by morning. She moved to the access hatch, prying it open with a crowbar that groaned in protest. Sparks danced as she exposed the wiring nest, her mind racing through contingencies. The three of them, survivors of the Exodus generation, trained on colony ships but born with Earth's ghosts in their blood, had come back to seed the planet, to prove humanity's ingenuity could mend what it broke. Now the stakes clawed higher. Failure meant not just their lives but the hope carried in the cryovaults of samples they'd salvaged. A low rumble shook the module, dust sifting from the ceiling like ash. Mira dropped her sealant, scrambling to brace. Incoming. The wind howled, slamming against the structure with the force of a tidal wave held at bay by thinning alloy. Jax lunged to reinforce the main strut, his muscles straining as bolts sheared. Ilera's hands flew over the wires, splicing a bypass with practiced speed, human fingers, deft and unyielding, turning desperation into a fragile lifeline. For a heartbeat, the hum steadied, lights brightening. But then the viewport cracked, a spiderweb fracture blooming outward. Myra's face paled, yet she grabbed an emergency patch kit without hesitation. Together, she said, and they moved as one, sealing the breach while the storm raged on. Outside, the sky churned, oblivious to the color it had forgotten, but inside their resolve burned brighter, a small triumph earned in sweat and silence, even as the real cost whispered in the failing seals. The signal from orbit crackled once more. Extraction delayed. They were on their own, but humanity's echo refused to fade. The dim glow of the emergency lights flickered across the control room, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. Ilara gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white as the ship's alarms wailed in rhythmic bursts. The hull groaned under the strain of the asteroid field's relentless barrage, another chunk of rock slamming into the shields, sending vibrations through the deck that rattled her teeth. She glanced at Jax, who was hunched over the navigation panel, his fingers flying across the holographic display, sweat beading on his forehead despite the recycled air's chill. "Shields at 40%, Jax muttered, his voice steady but edged with that familiar grit. He was the cautious one, always calculating odds, but right now his eyes burned with the fire of someone who'd bet everything on a single play. "We can't take another direct hit like that. Rerouting power from life support, buy us a minute." Ilara nodded, forcing her breath to even out. She was the brave heart of their duo, the one who'd pushed them to scavenge the derelict human outpost on the fringe world, chasing rumors of a forgotten warp drive. But bravery felt thin now, stretched taut as the failing barriers. The alien sky outside the viewport had turned a bruised purple, streaked with debris from the planet's shattered rings, a color that no Earth simulation could capture. Humanity had departed this sector centuries ago, leaving behind echoes in the ruins, tools, data logs, half-buried secrets. They'd come for those echoes for a way home, but the field had other plans. A sharp crackle from the comms interrupted her thoughts. "Jax, talk to me," she said, sliding into the pilot's seat. Her hands wrapped around the yokes, feeling the subtle resistance as the ship listed. He didn't look up. "I've got a vector, narrow gap in the field about 2 clicks out. But it's tight. We'll need to vent the cargo bay to lighten her, or the thrusters won't punch through." His words came clipped, each one a decision point. Venting meant losing their hull, the salvaged core from the outpost humming with ancient human code that could rewrite their jump coordinates. Ilara's stomach twisted. That core was their ticket out of this forsaken arm of the galaxy, a piece of ingenuity from a species long gone, designed to fold space without the fuel they'd run dry on years ago. Lose it, and they were adrift forever, ghosts themselves in the silence humanity left behind. But staying meant death by pulverization. "Do it," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We've come too far to fold now." Jax punched the command, and a distant whoosh echoed through the vents as atmosphere hissed into the void. The ship bucked, lighter now, but the alarm spiked, shields dipping to 30. Another rock glanced off the port side, sparks erupting in the corridor beyond the door. Ilara throttled up, the engines whining in protest, guiding them toward the holographic sliver of hope on the NAV screen. The gap loomed, a fleeting alley between tumbling boulders the size of shuttles. She wove the ship through, heart pounding, each dodge a prayer to forgotten stars. Jax called out adjustments, "Port 5 degrees now." His caution turning to sharp commands, their rhythm syncing like old partners in a dance with disaster. They cleared it by meters, the field receding as the ship burst into open space. But the victory was hollow. Sensors blared a new warning. The core's containment was breaching, exposed to the vacuum's bite. Ilara killed the engines, spinning in her seat. "Damage report?" Jack scanned the readouts, his face paling. "It's stable, but the data's corrupted. 20% loss. We might still jump, but the coordinates will be wrong," she finished, the weight settling in. The sky ahead stretched empty, colorless voids where humanity's lights had once burned. They'd survived the field, earned their breath, but the cost lingered. A flawed path home, one that could strand them deeper in the unknown. Ilara met his gaze, a wry smile breaking through. "Better than pulverized. Let's see what the old humans left us to fix." He chuckled, low and relieved as they turned to the flickering core. Together they'd patch it, clever hands on ancient grit, pushing into the silence, where the sky might yet remember its hues. Ilara's fingers trembled as she gripped the console, the dim glow of the auxiliary lights casting long shadows across the bridge. The ship's alarms had fallen silent hours ago, but the hum of failing systems echoed like a distant heartbeat. She glanced at Jax, his face etched with the same exhaustion that clawed at her own resolve. He'd been the one to suggest rerouting power from the cryobays, a desperate gambit that bought them time but sealed off the last escape for the remaining crew. "Status." Jax's voice cut through the quiet, steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "Life support's at 30%, Ilara replied, her words clipped. She tapped the screen, pulling up the schematics. The void outside pressed in, stars mocking their isolation. The departure of the human fleet, silent, unexplained, had left them adrift, but this was no mere abandonment. The anomaly, that swirling rift in the sky's fabric, had pulled their vessel into uncharted space, twisting reality until the colors bled away. Mira stirred from her station, her cautious nature finally cracking under the weight. We can't keep patching. The hull's integrity is dropping. If we don't seal the breach, we will, Jax interrupted, not harshly but with the grit that had kept them alive through the initial chaos. He stood, moving to the engineering panel with deliberate steps. His hands, calloused from years of manual overrides, danced over the controls. Ilara, sync the thrusters to the anomaly's pulse. Mira, monitor the radiation spikes. We ride it out or we don't. The plan had backfired once already, when their first alignment attempt destabilized the core, flooding the lower decks with plasma. 2 crew lost then, their absence a hollow ache. Now, with resources dwindling, failure meant suffocation in the dark. Ilara nodded, her brave facade holding as she initiated the sequence. The ship groaned, vibrations rattling through the deck plates. As the rift loomed larger on the view screen, a colorless maw devouring the stars, Myra's voice rose, edged with urgency. Jax, the readings, it's pulling harder. We're losing orbital stability. He didn't flinch. Instead, he wedged a makeshift brace against the panel, his witty sparks surfacing in the tension. Then let's give it something to chew on. Human stubbornness, indigestible. Ilara felt the pull in her gut, a nausea that matched the ship's lurch. She locked the coordinates, her mind flashing to the logs they'd recovered. Humanity's silent exodus, a calculated retreat from a galaxy turning hostile. But they weren't done yet. The thrusters fired in bursts, jagged and uneven, fighting the inexorable drag. A sharp crack echoed from the hull, sparks erupting nearby. Mira lunged, sealing a venting conduit with a portable welder, her movements precise despite the fear in her eyes. It's working, barely. But the sky, it's shifting. Through the viewport, the void flickered. Faint hues bled back in, blues and golds tentative like memory resurfacing. The anomaly recoiled, its colorless hunger sated for the moment. Jax slumped against the console, breathing hard. We're through. But the damage. Ilara scanned the readouts. The ship held, but the cost lingered. Cryobays offline, half the systems fried, and the rifts echo pulsing faintly in their wake. They were free, but the galaxy they returned to might not remember the color they'd fought to reclaim. Jax met her gaze, a silent pact forming. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Ingenuity unbroken, camaraderie their anchor. The engines hummed a low, steady thrum as the shuttle pierced the upper atmosphere, shedding the planet's clingy gravity like a skin. Elena gripped the controls, her knuckles pale against the worn plasteel, eyes fixed on the NAV display where the colony's lights blurred into a fading constellation below. The sky, once a bruised purple under the twin suns, stretched out now in endless black, indifferent to the world they'd abandoned. Jax leaned back in the co-pilot's seat, wiping grease from his hands on his jumpsuit. Well, that was a hell of a send-off. Remember when Mira thought the recycler was done for? Turns out it just needed a good kick, and my genius override code. His voice carried that familiar lilt, half joke, half relief, but his eyes darted to the rear viewport, where the planet receded like a discarded marble. Mira, strapped into the jump seat behind them, clutched a data slate, her fingers tracing the final logs. She'd been the one to spot the anomaly in the core samples, the underground aquifer poisoned by the seismic shifts, dooming the hydro farms for good. Cautious as ever, she'd argued for one last probe, buying them the time to jury-rig the shuttle's auxiliary tanks with colony-grade filters. Now her voice was quiet, laced with the weight of what they'd left. We got what we could. The seeds, the archives. But the others, they chose to stay. The words hung, unspoken names of friends who'd planted roots too deep, betting on a miracle that never came. A soft chime broke the silence, the fuel gauge stabilizing at 70%, thanks to Jax's mad scramble to siphon the last reserves from the grounded freighter. Elena allowed herself a breath, easing the throttle as stars pricked the void ahead. The departure had been silent, no fanfare, no broadcast to the void. Just a final systems check, a shared nod, and the burn that carried them away. Below, the sky would forget its color soon enough, the storms erasing their footprints in red dust. But in the hold, the crate of hybrid seeds rattled faintly, a promise of regrowth on some distant rock. Elena glanced at her crew, the only family left. Next stop, whatever's out there. We make it ours. Jax grinned, Mira nodded, and the shuttle slipped into the dark, carrying humanity's quiet defiance forward. Yet in the quiet hours that followed, each felt the pull of the world behind, a scar on the soul, invisible but enduring.